Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and you know what? I think this is probably the most important video that I do each and every season. Because let's face it, it's not hard to find a content creator pushing their deck of the day that's the best deck ever, right up until tomorrow where they have a new best deck ever. And they'll tell you it's got an 80% win rate because they played 10 games. And finding meta deck lists and downloading them and crafting them is not hard at all. But for us budget players, finding the decks that represent real value and understanding the how and the why, both in the long term and the short term, can be a little bit difficult, but it doesn't have to be scary. But before we get into all that, this season, Duskmourn is focused on that horror genre and all of those fears that us 1/1 human tokens tend to share. But you know what I really find horrifying? Only 1/3 of the viewers that regularly watch my content have subscribed to the channel. So come on guys, take a moment, sub to the channel, support the content, and be sure to check your notification settings so you never miss out on a thing. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. There are a number of factors that I consider when I'm evaluating these decks. Of course, first and foremost is how playable is the deck. Because if it's not going to help you grind out those daily wins, it's probably not an ideal candidate. Secondly, how much support does this deck get from things like your starter decks, your jump-in resources, and just following the plan? Next up, a deck needs to be timely, whether that is about those resources and how likely you are to continue collecting those resources, or is the deck due for a ban, or maybe it's coming up on its rotation. And of course, formats play a factor as well. If a deck is likely to do something in a non-standard format, whether that is Alchemy, Eternal formats, or one of the Brawl bases, it's good to have flexible deck concepts. One thing you'll notice that isn't here is how fun a deck is, because fun is a very subjective thing, and I'm not here to tell you the quote-unquote right way to have fun. You're going to need to figure that out for yourself. When I'm doing evaluations, I like to use what I lovingly refer to as the Eastwood rating system, breaking your choices down into 3 easy categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good decks are just that. These are what represent your best daily grinder decks and the best places for you to invest your resources to get the optimal result to effort ratios. These decks tend to be a full standard deviation mathematically above the moving average of all the decks that we're looking at. Bad decks, on the other hand, tend to be a little more tongue-in-cheek as far as the naming convention. These decks are, in fact, centered around that moving average of all the other decks. And despite what the name might imply, these decks are still perfectly playable. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend putting a lot of resources into these decks because they're just not as well positioned as the good right now. But of course, as card pools and metas change, these could very easily shift up or down the spectrum. And finally, ugly decks are sadly just that. Although these might have been in-season darlings, they just didn't pan out the way they wanted to, and it's not really worth investing resources into these decks. But if you already have them and enjoy them, there's really no harm in playing these existing decks. They just don't seem to have a pathway to move out of this particular category, although from time to time you might see one of these move up. All right, so let's start the conversation off with getting the ugly decks out of the way. And there is one deck, due to inopportune timing, is really slipping down from that tier 2 to tier 3 ugly status, and that is the Brawl deck built around Captain Storm, the Cosmium Raider. Obviously, this is an Artifacts Matter with a pirate sub-theme, and neither Bloomburrow or Duskmourn is really any sort of artifact-centered deck. Those sets just did not focus on that. They did have some artifacts, but not anything of real focus here to give Captain Storm a push up that she was kind of hoping for. We also can expect Foundations will have some artifacts in it, but probably not as many, since this is going to be kind of a pseudo core set. We will probably be seeing slightly less artifacts, and it will probably be come spring before we really have hopes of an artifact-centered set. That would be the upcoming Death Race set, which is going to have a lot of vehicles and things like that. We might see an artifact sub-theme there. A lot of people are saying that one of the 3 planes that we'll be visiting in that set will be Kaladesh, and of course that always has a strong artifact theme. But for now, I'd put Captain Storm on the back burner. If you have already built this deck, there's no reason to not play it, but I don't think I'd be investing resources in it right now. Don't be fooled, in this video we're going to be talking a lot about new decks being added this season, and well, some of those are going to fall in the ugly category, but still potentially worth keeping on the back burner. First off, let's talk about Delirium. Sadly, this mechanic is kind of diametrically opposed to a lot of the Graveyard Matters mechanics that are already present in Standard. Delirium, of course, wants you to have card types in your graveyard, things like sorceries, instants, artifacts, etc., etc. Whereas the Insidious Roots decks that have been buzzing in and out of Standard care about permanents only, and it wants you to remove those from the graveyard. Likewise, the Collect Evidence mechanic also only cares about cards with casting cost, but also wants you to remove those from the graveyard. So Delirium is kind of in a tough spot at the moment, where it has to be its own standalone thing. It really can't lean on other graveyard mechanics currently in Standard. But no joking around, this deck has a lot of potential. Things like the 1-2 punch of Patchwork Bestie on turn 1, followed up by Wildfire Wickerfolk. That puts 7 potential power on the table by turn 2, and doggone it, that's going to give your opponent something to not only think about, but have to deal with. Then once you throw in some additional high synergy cards like Altanak, the Thrice Called, and its brother-in-arms, Say Its Name, and well, you're just adding more and more potential to this deck. Let's not forget that Delirium is a pretty easy deck for us to build as budget players. Not only is the red-green Delirium one of the better limited archetypes right now, but it's also supported in your deck building attributes through a mono-red Delirium themed jump-in pack that not only gives you lots of different card types that Delirium wants, but also gives you access to some pretty top-notch rares, like Fear of Missing Out. So overall, when it comes to Delirium, particularly as a budget deck, I would feel good about adding these lower rarity pieces to your collection, but I would not invest wild cards in this archetype just yet. However, let's keep in mind that this set and this archetype has approximately 34 months left in Standard, and that's a lot of time for these very accessible budget pieces to come to full use. Another new deck that is finding itself kind of in the ugly position right now is the mostly Simic face down deck. Really, at the moment, there's a lot of other things you can be doing with Simic that are just better than this as far as showing up in the meta. In fact, we really haven't seen a viable face-down deck at all in Standard or in Alchemy, and I don't believe it's really shown up in Historic, but I'll be honest, I don't watch that meta quite as close. The issue here primarily for me making a recommendation to budget players is the fact that this deck is going to want some pre-existing cards, whether that is from Murders at Karlov Manor for standard, or the Khans of Tarkir set in something like an Eternal format. This kind of relegates this deck more as a long-term passion project than it is really a meta-reliable deck. And believe it or not, there is one last deck that we need to talk about in the ugly category, and this one might surprise some of you a little bit, because we're going to talk about the primarily white Enchantress decks, led by things like Optimistic Scavenger and Sheltered by Ghosts. I think the best build for budget players right now is the blue-white build. But of course there are also some green-white variants, particularly in Eternal formats, that might be just as relevant or potentially even more relevant. This deck right now is putting up some numbers. It's about 55%. And the only thing that's got this in the ugly category in my mind right now is the fact that it is so heavily built around cards from Duskmourn. And granted, these are commons and uncommons, but for us budget players, this becomes kind of a late season deck because we don't want to spend wild cards on cards that we're eventually going to open. But we probably won't have a chance to talk about this deck next season when it's more viable. So let's talk about how that deck should look right now. Alright, so let's take a look at this Woo Enchantress build. The core of the deck almost exclusively comes from Duskmourn, so a lot of us budget players are not going to be able to put this deck together until late season, once we've opened the majority of our packs and done our drafting and all that sort of thing. But really the core of this is almost a mono-white build. You need 4 copies each of Ethereal Armor, whether that's the new version or the old version, Optimistic Scavenger, Shark Mage's Rescue, and of course the nearly mythic uncommon Sheltered by Ghosts. From there you want 4 each again of the 2 Signpost uncommons for Azorius from Duskmourn. That's Gremlin Tamer and Inquisitive Glimmer. And beyond that, you want about 6 copies total of a removal / protection package. The 3 top contenders for this are all 2-drops. That's a Feather of Flight, which gives you evasion and a power boost rather, and draws you a card. Ossification is, of course, just straight removal. And Fey Flight, which gives you evasion and a power boost as well as hexproof. So certainly one of the top contenders. Now that leaves you about a slot to 2 slots of filler cards, and this is another reason that this deck ends up being very budget friendly, because if you notice, everything we've talked about so far are commons and uncommons. You can fill this in with eerie creatures readily available to you through the mono blue jump-in pack of Duskmourn. There's also at least 3 rares available to you through jump-in, Enduring Innocence, Entity Tracker, and Enduring Curiosity, all of which fit very, very nicely. Running multiple copies on that is not going to hurt you anything at all. Also, some of the enchantment creatures out there from Lionheart Glimmer and Fear of Falling, both of which I believe are also available to you through Jump-In. And then, of course, there's some runes that give you some nice utility. The Grand Entryway gives you multiple enchantment door hits. Surgical Suite allows you to return a key card like either your Tamer, your Glimmer, or your Optimistic Scavenger very easily. Also allows you to further pump creatures, maybe beyond your Voltron creature as well, which start diversifying your threats on the board. And of course, Bottomless Pool gives you a nice tempo play. and Locker Room kind of gives you an alternative version of the Enduring Curiosity effect. And of course, Mana Base can be built a variety of ways. What I'm showing here is one of the more budget-friendly options. Now, what do you say we move on and talk about some good decks? And you guys grab a seat, go ahead, get comfy, because the reality is some of you guys aren't going to want to hear this. The number one most efficient thing that you can be doing to improve your decks, your win rates right now, is add Leyline to your existing mono red prowess deck. Now, yeah, you're probably going to have to change up some other cards. I did a whole video on how to build the deck. But the fact of the matter is that this deck is pushing a 57% win rate. And despite what a lot of people think, I firmly believe it's going to be at least 6 months before we're looking at a real potential banning of Leyline here. I think something else has got to give. I've spent the last 3 or 4 days poring over the meta numbers, and aggro, mono red, none of that has really gone up as far as its percentage of the meta. The win rates really haven't gone up that much, but the older versions of the decks, those have dropped, and their win rates have dropped. So if you want your mono red deck to stay kind of where it was, put 4 Leylines in it, and there you go. Okay, now you guys really need to brace yourself, because for some of y'all, I'm getting ready to say a dirty word. That's right, it's alchemy. I know, a lot of people don't like it. It almost isn't a real format in a lot of people's minds. Content about it generally doesn't do well. But the reality is several of our top tier budget decks are doing even better in alchemy. If you look at the white-black Bat Life deck that we talked about a while back, it's running about a 57% win rate right now in Standard. You take that same deck over to Alchemy, and it's pushing a little over 60%. Similarly, the mono-white starter deck in Alchemy right now is pushing like a 64% win rate. I can't explain it. It seems absurd, but there it is. Several weeks in a row, this deck is just putting up exponentially good numbers. Similarly, the mono white rabbits that is kind of going to morph into a tokens deck over time. In Standard, it's running a 56% win rate. In Alchemy, it's just over 58%. So if you've built some of these decks, but maybe you're having a little trouble efficiently getting through your daily wins and things like that, consider taking the same deck over to Alchemy. You might be surprised at just how well it does. And I wanted to wrap up the good deck section with something a little less controversial. And let's keep in mind that the existing green-white starter deck, the Saddle Up deck, should theoretically get a boost from the green-white survival cards presented in Duskmourn. But I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't had a minute to test this whatsoever. But at the very least, this shouldn't make the deck any worse. So if you have some experience with the Saddle Up deck, you have a version that you really like, I suggest trying some incidental survival cards that you've picked up, see if it improves the deck, and let the rest of us know what you find, because you're going to be on the cutting edge here, probably far more than I am. And if you've been paying attention, you know that what we've got left to talk about is the bad. Those decks that aren't quite good enough to be top tier choices, but aren't ugly enough to be ignored completely. The first thing I think we really need to talk about is a downgrade. Last season we had Mono Black Discard as a top tier deck. And the fact is, Bandit's Talent has not ended up being the build-around uncommon that we wanted it to be. Now, in truth, this deck is tracking about a 55% win rate. But when you factor out the rage quits from people discarding 2, 3, maybe even 4 cards in a row, the win rate on this deck is pretty abysmal. I mean, it drops down to like 30-something when you factor out those rage quits, because the deck just has a hard time finishing games. Of course, some upcoming sets might change that. This card is going to be in Standard a total of roughly 36 months. And a lot of things could change, but right now, I don't think this is where we want to be putting our resources. And there's just one more deck I wanted to talk about here in the ugly category. It's a deck I did not expect to really be talking about this year. And in truth, if you're a newer and very budget-minded player, this is probably not the place you want to be. But the reality is, the Jin is back. And particularly if you have already built a version of this deck, if you already have 4 copies of the Jin, it is a great time to put this deck back together and put it into your rotation. It's running a 57% win rate, and unlike last time it was popular, it only represents about 1.4% of the meta. Last time around it was pushing like 5%. So nobody sees this deck coming, and well, much like with the Bandit Talent discard deck, you get some rage quits out of this too, which are just freebies. And like I said, a 57% win rate, if you can put this deck together on the cheap, it's a pretty good way to do it. Why don't we take a look and see how that can be done right now. All right, let's start this mono blue discussion by taking a look at what is pretty much the meta consensus. As you can see here, they are running the full 4-pack of Potty Jin. Totally agree with that. They're running a total of 24 lands. I think that's a little high, and the inclusion of 2 blast zones, to me, feels unnecessary. I do like the 3 steps ahead. Everybody has at least one of these from this year's starters, and if you have more, certainly run them. I think Negate, Sleight of Hand, all of these are pretty good choices. Flow of Knowledge, I'm glad to see the meta finally come around to the idea that 3 Flow of Knowledge is really, really good on this. All the more reason to not run Blast Zone, but you know, I think Moment of Truth is not the correct choice here. Dispersal's decent, Phantom Interference is good, and I think Into the Flood Maw is a good enough card that it probably deserves more than 2 copies. So with that having been said, what do you say we take a look at my version of the ideal on this deck? Alright, so let's take a look at this mono blue Jin deck, or as I call it, mono blue control. And I've got the deck broken down by categories. The most obvious is just lands. We need 20 islands. That's really it. We don't need to get fancy with this. One of the appeals of this is it's a monocolor deck, so we can get very lean on our mana base. Over here we've got a tempo piece Into the Flood Maw. Basically just lets you tap a creature. Don't be afraid to gift a fish if it lets you take a non-land permanent off the field that's problematic. Most of the metas are only running like 2 copies of this. I think it deserves at least 3, and I would start with 4. This is going to do work for you more often than not. Of course, the next package is card draw. For Sleight of Hand, this is pretty ubiquitous thinking at this point. It's not as good as what we had last year, but hey, it's not last year. That's what we do. Also running 4 copies of Curate. This allows you to surveil 2, potentially putting things into your graveyard, and then draw a card. It is infinitely better for this deck than Moment of Truth, which I am running 0 copies of. From the starter collection, we've got Prof's Eidetic Memory. Had to think about how to say that for a minute. This is a rare that came to you for free. Everybody's got one. And this is a legendary enchantment, so running more than 1 can be counterproductive. Also, this deck wants to do things at the end of your opponent's turn, and Prof's Memory here kinda wants you to draw cards during your own turn. So, you know, there's a balancing issue there, but I do think it's worth running. Also from your starters, 2 copies of Quick Study, 3 mana, draw 2 cards. It doesn't get much better than that. And of course, Flow of Knowledge. I'm running 3 copies on this. You could run 2 copies of Flow of Knowledge and 3 on Quick Study. Just swapping 1 for 1 might be a more budget-friendly version for some of you, but Flow of Knowledge lets you draw a card for every island you control and then discard 2 cards. Really awesome. The next package is your flexible instance slots, and we're seeing more and more of this in the design space. We've got Phantom Interference, which allows you to counter a spell or create a 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. We're running 4 copies of that, and you can even do both if you have all the mana in the world. Of course, 3 steps ahead, everybody got one of these. If you have more, I would certainly run them over something like the next card we're going to talk about, Confounding Riddle or Spellgeyser. But everybody has one, there's no reason not to run it. It lets you counter a spell, create a token copy of an artifact or a creature you control, or draw 2 cards, then discard a card. I mean, this is just an absolute workhorse. And because it's free, if you have all the mana in the world again, you can do multiple things with it. Confounding Riddle is another one of those flex cards. You can counter a spell unless its controller pays 4. And let's be honest, not many people are going to be in a position to pay 4. So it's almost a hard counter. Look at the top of 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the rest in your graveyard. So you do have to pick one or the other with this. It's not free, you can't get both. But it is a very flexible card. And of course, also we have the 4 mana Spellgeyser. It's a hard counter spell, or Surveil 2, then draw 2. Both great options. Rebalancing these to have more 3 steps ahead, I think is fantastic. But I think the total quantity of 10 here is about right. For just your hard counter suite, we're just running 2 copies in the gate. And I think that's enough. We might have to reevaluate this slot based on future sets, but it's a really solid card. And then we got our creature package. And from here, what we really want is a total of 10 creatures. You've got Steamcore Scholar. When it enters, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, unless you discard an instant or a sorcery, or a creature with flying. So it's a 3 mana 2/2 flying vigilance. Draw cards, put things you want in your graveyard. Really great. Of course, 4 copies of Hadi Djinn. I think, I wouldn't build this deck with less than 3 copies. I really wouldn't. And if that's too much of a stretch for your budget, that's a good sign that this deck is not for you. Maybe you're a little too young in your arena career for this deck right now. That's perfectly understandable. We do have, what is that, Eluge, the Shoreless Sea? I don't know. I got a little bit of dry mouth, and that one was really pushing it. It's a 4 mana. It's equal to the number of islands you control. It's a nice thing, but it's a mythic. If you've got it and you want to test it, great. If you don't, I wouldn't give it a second thought. And the reason I wouldn't worry about it too much is because you've got Tolarian Terror, 6 mana, 5/5, Ward 2, and don't underestimate that Ward 2. And it costs less, 1 mana, for every instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. Guess what we were doing back here with all these draws and surveils and casting counter spells and things like that? We're putting those cards in our graveyard to make Tolarian Terror cost 1 mana. It's very irritating for your opponent when you can do that. The new addition that's very, very similar is the Eddymark Crab. It's a total of 7 mana, which can be reduced down to 2. It does the same thing. It reduces 1 mana for every instant and sorcery in your graveyard. It does enter tapped on your turn, but it has flash, so you can hold up your mana for counter spells and stuff like that. And if your opponent passes turn and doesn't do anything that you needed to respond to, you can flash an Eddymark Crab, potentially for as little as 2 mana. It's a 5/5 body, and when it enters, tap up to 2 target creatures. So maybe something you want to do right before your opponent moves to combat as well. Could be just a very versatile card overall. It's a great time for this deck right now. Like I said, it's running like a 57% win rate. The last time I polled prior to recording this segment, it was like 1.4% of the meta. It's actually less than that now because other decks have shifted up. It's like less than 1%. I think it was like 0.83% of the broader meta. So nobody sees this coming. You don't really have to worry about the mirror match at this point. Just a really good, solid deck. and learning to pilot something like this. A lot of us have been playing this deck already for like 2 years, and learning to pilot this effectively is just an absolute case study in control decks. Now, just a couple more points here as we wrap things up. Some of you may remember last season I talked about the mostly white/red aggro decks out there, and how there was like 8 different versions of the deck that people could be playing, ranging from the Azorius Soldiers all the way up to my personal favorite at that time, Mono White Rabbit. And my suggestion was to pick one of these and build that deck, and not to try and build them all, just to be happy with one. And I had a lot of people reach out to me directly and kind of question the logic behind that, because so many of these decks have overlap. Why not build them all, etc., etc.? And well, the answer is this. All it takes is one card like Pyroclasm printed at uncommon, and suddenly an entire archetype, the go wide, go tall aggro decks, are kind of wiped off the map pretty quickly. Pyroclasm really hasn't been embraced by Standard as of yet, but it's really only a matter of time before somebody comes up with an X-red control deck that puts this card to really good use. And it might be a mono red deck, because interestingly enough, your own prowess creatures can often survive the Pyroclasm and sweep away any sort of blocking opposition. And honestly, if it feels like I'm not really recommending a lot of brewing and deck crafting right now, well, you're not wrong. The reason being is Foundations is going to be hitting not just Arena, but Magic and Standard in, well, as little as 4 weeks, and really previews might start next week. And I really anticipate that this set is going to have a big impact on things like Standard. So we might be better off saving our resources for the post-Foundation Standard, because, well, Foundations is going to be around for a very long time. So that's the headlines when it comes to budget decks this season. Obviously, I can't talk about every deck because, well, right now we're tracking like 30 different decks, and I would die. But not to worry, we've got the full breakdown and analysis over on the Patreon. You can find the link down in the description. Always a free thing that I do over there is the budget decks. A little support goes a long way in this community because, of course, we are budget-minded in everything we do. But have no fear, even if you aren't prepared to support the Stronghold will continue to support you. And, of course, links for those 2 budget deck breakdowns that we talked about specifically within the video can also be found down in the description. But most importantly, I want to hear from you. Let me know what you're thinking of these decks. What sort of results are you getting? What should be on my radar that isn't? Tell me everything you got to say. You have a vital role in this community. And before we go, while every member of this community is important to me, I just wanted to take a moment and give a shout out to those patrons providing financial support and keeping the Stronghold from being a complete financial black hole. And of course, let me leave you with some suggestions for your next step here on the channel.